Strength doesn't come from what you can do. It comes from overcoming the things you thought you couldn't. Arnold Schwarzenegger. The business class line hummed with quiet, manufactured elegance, sleek marble beneath scuffed designer shoes, idle coughs, the rustle of boarding passes in premium leather wallets. It smelled faintly of citrus and entitlement. Ava stood near the velvet rope, hoodie sleeves tugged over her thumbs, a duffel bag sagging from her shoulder. She wasn't tall, but she stood straight, like someone who'd practiced that part. Like posture could make up for anything else. People didn't stare, not directly, but she could feel them adjusting their eyes, like they didn't know where to place her. Too young for business class, maybe. Too plain. Too not what they expected. When her turn came, she stepped forward with quiet certainty. She'd rehearsed this, ID in one hand, boarding pass in the other. Voice calm, eyes forward. But the woman behind the counter, Tina, according to the crooked name tag, barely masked the once-over. Boarding pass, Tina asked, drawing the syllables out like she wasn't sure they belonged to English. Ava handed it over. No smile, no apology, just breath. Tina didn't take the pass right away. She squinted at it like it might be counterfeit, then tilted her head, a smile forming that wasn't a smile at all. This is for business class, she asked. Ava nodded. Once? You flying solo with that name? A pause. Ava wasn't sure if she was supposed to answer. Tina flipped the ID, blinked once. Ava Schwarzenegger. Another nod. Tina's breath hitched a brief intake, like a hiccup of disbelief. Then the laugh. It wasn't loud, but it traveled, slipped between conversations and clinked coffee cups. You're kidding? She leaned in slightly. What's next? You drove here in a tank. Ava stayed silent, not because she didn't have a comeback, but because she'd been here before in other rooms. Other looks, other assumptions. Sorry, sweetheart, but the whole I'm someone famous thing, bit overdone. Don't you think she didn't blink? She didn't flinch. Tina's fingers hovered over the keyboard, then stopped. She leaned back with a kind of smugness Ava had learned to recognize early, the kind that thinks it's clever. I've seen kids try this, she said. Fake IDs, borrowed card, you name it. But using his name, Ava said nothing. You do know impersonating someone's family is a federal offense. Right, I'm not impersonating anyone. Flat, calm, the way she'd practiced, but Tina just smiled wider. Sure. Let me guess he raised you in a chalet somewhere in Austria, and you just happened to forget your Prada bag this morning. That one stung, not because it was personal, but because it was lazy, like the joke didn't even try. A man in a sport coat, two people behind Ava shifted. A phone lifted. Subtly. She noticed, but barely. Tina finally tapped her keyboard. The screen blinked. Well, she said, it scans, but her eyes said something else. Then her voice dropped low. Too sweet. Stay right here. We'll get this sorted. Her fingers dipped below the counter, a silent alert, and Ava just stood there, like she always had, still, too still. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It didn't take long. Two security agents arrived before Ava could even check the time. One was tall, with mirrored sunglasses and the kind of build that said retired military, still clings to it. The other was younger, thinner, chewing gum like it owed him rent. Neither introduced themselves. The taller one, Donahue, according to the tag, spoke first. Miss, step aside for a random screening. Ava didn't move. I already cleared TSA. You were flagged again, he said, as if that explained everything. It didn't, but they weren't here to explain. She glanced back at Tina. The woman was already folding her arms behind the desk, satisfied, like this was a game, and she just scored a point. Ava tightened her grip on the duffel. Can I ask what flagged me? You can, the younger one, Marquez said, but we're still going to check. She exhaled slowly. Her breath felt heavier than it should have. They led her a few steps off to the side. There was no privacy. Just a folding table and a flickering light overhead that buzzed faintly. Like a reminder, it was the airport's cheapest bulb. Travelers slowed as they passed. Some kept walking, others didn't. A woman nearby pulled her kid a little closer. Marquez motioned to the duffel. Put it on the table. Ava did, carefully, like it was something fragile. Because part of it was, Marquez unzipped it with the flair of someone who thought he was uncovering something criminal. Her hoodie came out first, then hand wraps, rolled tightly, black cloth faintly worn at the edges. Next came the protein bars, earbuds tangled like nerves. Then the notebook. He paused. "What's this workout notes?" she said. He flipped it open. Bold block lettering, sketches, combos. No names, just technique. He raised an eyebrow. "These real? I wrote them." Donahue dug deeper. Out came a sports spray bottle. "Is this yours?" he asked. Ava nodded. "What is it? Muscle recovery." He shook it next to his ear. Could be aerosol masking, could be a stimulant, could be something else. "It's not quiet," he said. Not loud, but firm. Someone behind the rope lifted a phone. Again. Ava's stomach sank a little more. She could feel the edges of herself starting to fray. Donahue pulled out a small container, vitamin pills. He opened it like it might explode. "Just iron and magnesium," he muttered. Marquez kept going. Then her underwear appeared, rolled, modest, private until now. One pair slipped, unrolled near the edge of the table. Marquez snorted. Well, she packed for style. A couple of teens behind the barrier giggled. One whispered. She brought her whole dorm. Ava didn't respond, didn't reach for anything, just stood still. Still, like she didn't feel the heat crawling up her neck, like her throat wasn't tightening. Marquez held up the notebook again. "This one's real disciplined." "Huh," he said, loud enough for people to hear. Donahue added, "Or really good at pretending." A beat. Then he asked, "You sure you're not hiding something?" Ava looked at them both and said, evenly, "I wouldn't need to." But no one was listening. Not really. Not yet. The last thing in the bag was wrapped in cloth, carefully, intentionally. Donahue tugged at the corner, fingers rough, not curious, just impatient. "Careful," Ava said, and it came out faster than she meant. He paused, looked at her, then kept unwrapping anyway, layers unfolding like skin peeled back too fast. Inside was a ceramic mug, white, hairline crack curling across one side. Faded blue ink read, "To Ava, my fighter." Donahue held it like it was nothing, turned it once, shrugged. Sentimental junk. He reached to set it down, but his grip slipped. Just a little, just enough. The mug clacked against the edge of the metal table, wobbled. Ava's breath caught. One bounce, two. Then it hit the floor. It didn't shatter. It fractured, quietly, cleanly, the way old things break when they've been held together too long. Ava's body moved before her mind did. She dropped to a crouch, hands out, fingers scrambling across the tile to gather the pieces. One shard scraped her thumb. Blood rose in a fine line. "She's bleeding," someone whispered behind the rope. Marquez snapped, stepped back but not at her, at the crowd. Ava stayed crouched, one knee down, other up, like someone frozen halfway through prayer. Her hand trembled as she reached for the last shard. She cradled it in her palm like it still mattered. Because it did. Because it was the only thing that still felt real. "Seriously," Tina called from the counter, her voice loud and syrupy. "A broken mug in a gym bag. You sure that's not just part of the act?" Ava didn't look up. "Was that from your real dad?" Tina added. "Or the one you pretend exists when it suits you?" There it was. The kind of sentence that doesn't just hurt, it rewrites the day. Ava stood up slowly. Her palms were red now. Her sleeve had soaked some of it, but her face didn't change. She looked right through Tina, through Marquez, through Donahue, and for a second, maybe two, everything went still. Not quiet, just still. Like the moment before a fire alarm, or an avalanche, or someone slams a door they can't ever reopen. The crowd leaned in slightly. They didn't mean to, but they did. And still, Ava said nothing. She placed the largest shard into the cloth and folded it closed, gentle like folding a flag. The others followed, one by one, until the cloth was a soft, awkward bundle. She tucked it back into her bag, zippered it part way. It didn't zip smoothly. Of course it didn't. Marquez crossed his arms, trying to look unfazed. Donahue checked his watch. Ava looked at neither of them. Not anymore. Not now. She wasn't thinking about her flight. She wasn't even thinking about being believed. She was thinking about the sound the mug made when it hit the floor. How quiet it was. How respectful. Like it knew it had no place surviving here. They didn't tell her she could go. They just moved on. Donahue walked away without a word, probably to report that nothing explosive had been found, unless you counted the mug. Marquez stayed behind a moment longer, watching her like she might still do something dramatic. She didn't. She stood there, bag re-zipped but off-center now, hoodie stained, fingers still red, sleeve sticking to her skin where the blood had dried in a shallow line. Nobody offered a tissue or an apology. They didn't even really look at her, not directly, just glances, quick ones, like she was a mess someone else should clean up. The crowd behind the rope began to thin. Phones lowered. Interest faded, just another incident without resolution. And Tina. She had already gone back to typing something on her terminal. Her lips pursed like she was still annoyed that her suspicion didn't get the ending she'd hoped for. Ava turned away from the inspection table without asking for permission. Nobody stopped her. Nobody helped either. She walked slowly, not because she was afraid, but because something in her pace had cracked too. Her left shoe squeaked a little when she stepped, scuffed from kneeling on the tile. The holding bench was cold. It sat just beyond the security gates, facing the automatic glass doors where people came in but rarely looked down. The seats were molded plastic, curved like they were made for some other body, not hers. She sat anyway. The duffel dropped beside her, heavier now, not physically, just heavier. She didn't check her phone at first, just stared ahead. Her hands were clasped in her lap like she wasn't sure what they were supposed to be doing anymore. People passed. Some looked. None stopped. It wasn't the first time Ava had felt invisible, but today felt worse because she'd been visible just long enough for everyone to decide who she was. And now they were done. Her fingers curled, thumb brushing the cut. It stung, a small throb that reminded her this was still real. Finally, she pulled out her phone. The screen blinked awake. No messages. A silent rectangle of light. At the top of her favorites list, one name, Opa. She stared at it, not pressing it, not yet. What would she even say? They tore through my things. They laughed at your name. They made me feel like I stole it. Maybe that was too much. Maybe it was exactly enough. She tapped the name. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Then, "Hey, kid." His voice, calm, familiar, like gravel over oak wood. It held. She didn't answer right away. "Ava," he asked. Just once. Her throat was too tight, but somehow she got it out. They said, "I lied." Silence. Not empty, just full of motion. Full of him deciding what came next. "Where are you?" he asked. She looked up at the automatic doors. Near baggage claim. Past security. "They told me I had to wait unless the person who booked the ticket showed up." More silence. "Then I'm coming," he said. "They won't let you in." "They will," Arnold said. Simple. Final. She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "Okay." The call had ended 5 minutes ago. Maybe 10. Ava wasn't sure anymore. Time had gone soft around the edges, like fabric pulled too thin. Outside the glass doors, people came and went with the usual blur of rolling suitcases and half-spoken arguments about gates and carry-ons. No one looked in her direction. That felt strange, and also expected. She sat curled slightly forward, knees drawn up, elbows resting on them. The hoodie sleeves still hid her hands, but the blood had crusted now, a faint brown line across her thumb. She didn't touch it. The cloth-wrapped mug shards were back inside her bag, buried near the gloves and the notebook like they needed to be kept together, like they might hold each other up. The sound it made when it cracked, it wouldn't leave her. It wasn't the noise itself. It was the fact that no one reacted. No gasp, no pause. It had broken, and people kept watching, but no one cared. Maybe they didn't think it mattered. Maybe they didn't think she did. A little boy with bright green sneakers walked past holding his mother's hand. He pointed, whispering something. The mom glanced quickly, tightened her grip, and kept moving. Ava didn't blame her. She wasn't sure what she looked like right now. Not dangerous, just misplaced. She looked at her phone again. No updates, no message. But she didn't need one. When her grandfather said, "I'm coming," he didn't mean eventually. He meant now. Still, her fingers hovered over the screen like maybe she should do something. Maybe call again. Maybe Schwarzenegger. Huh. The voice came from her left. A man, maybe late 30s, navy sport coat. Probably had AirPods tucked somewhere, even if he wasn't wearing them. She looked up, not defensively, just tired. "I heard the lady at the counter," he said, half shrugging. "Rough morning." Ava didn't reply. He waited, then added, "You related to him." She nodded once. He smirked not cruelly, just curiously. "Sure you're not just using the name?" She turned back to the terminal window. Didn't answer. Couldn't. Not without saying too much. The man didn't press. He walked off a second later, checking his watch like his curiosity had been a minor layover. But the question hung there, not in the air. In her, it wasn't new. It never was. From classrooms to coaches, bus drivers to DMV clerks, even friends some asked kindly. Some didn't. "Are you really one of them?" She wasn't even sure who them meant anymore. Famous, strong-worthy. She'd grown up in a quiet neighborhood, not a mansion. Her father Arnold's adopted son had been a firefighter. Died in one. The mug had come from his hospital room, before it all unraveled. Arnold hadn't said much back then. He just showed up, stayed, chose her, and now, once again, he was on his way. Not because she called for help, but because she didn't have to. Because she carried the name, and he knew what that cost. It started with the sound of the doors. Not the sharp hiss some expect, but a low whoosh like the air stepped aside on instinct. The kind of sound that doesn't demand attention, but earns it anyway. He walked in without security clearance, without credentials held aloft, without anyone announcing his name. The terminal didn't need it. Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped through the glass doors like gravity made room for him. No entourage, no smile, just a leather jacket worn smooth at the elbows and boots that had seen more than any of these people ever would. He didn't rush. He didn't pause. He scanned. Ava sat still, her posture instinctively shrinking, as if unsure what version of herself he'd see. The one who held together or the one who shattered their eyes met. His expression didn't change because it didn't need to. She stood slowly, legs stiff. The hoodie sleeve still clung to her wrist where blood had dried, but she didn't hide it now. He reached her in 5 steps, maybe 6, and stopped just short, looked at her hand first, not the face, not the uniform, the hand. Then, quietly, "You okay?" She nodded. It wasn't convincing. He glanced at the duffel, noticed the half-zipped edge, the cloth tucked awkwardly inside. Broken, her voice barely made it. The mug. It fell. A flicker crossed his face, something just behind the eyes. Not anger, not sadness. Memory. He gave a small nod, then turned and walked past her, toward the security zone. Two guards stiffened at once. Marquez and Donahue, same uniforms, same postures, suddenly unsure of their own authority. One of them reached for his earpiece, muttering something Ava couldn't hear. Arnold didn't break stride. Charles, the terminal manager, appeared halfway down the corridor, face pale and pulled tight like he'd just been briefed on a fire he'd have to explain. He extended a hand too quickly. "Mr. Schwarzenegger, sir, there's been a misunderstanding." Arnold didn't shake it, didn't even glance at it. His voice, when it came, was calm, deep, and dangerously quiet. "Which one of you made her bleed?" The words hit the room like a dropped anvil. Silence cracked. No one answered. Phones lifted again, quietly, subtly. Someone whispered, "That's really him." Another, nearer Ava, said, "That's her grandfather." Arnold turned slightly, just enough to see Ava out of the corner of his eye. She looked smaller next to him, but not alone anymore. His gaze swept the room, not hurried, like he was cataloging every face, every badge, every silent witness. Charles cleared his throat. "Sir, I assure you," Arnold raised a finger. Not a threat, just a pause. "You don't get to speak about procedure," he said, "when the first thing you broke was her dignity." The terminal froze again. Not from fear, from recognition. Something had shifted, and no one was quite sure how to shift it back. Charles tried again. "Mr. Schwarzenegger, I understand your frustration, but this wasn't personal. The agents were following protocol." Arnold didn't blink. "Protocol," he echoed, like he was tasting the word and not impressed with the flavor. Marquez shifted behind the inspection desk, eyes darting to Donahue, who stared at the floor like maybe it held a better explanation than he did. "She presented a suspicious ticket," Charles continued. "Booked third party, no travel profile. She didn't look." He stopped. "Too late." Arnold's eyes narrowed. She didn't look what Charles hesitated. A beat too long. Arnold stepped forward once, just once, and the manager instinctively stepped back. "You saw a hoodie and a name you didn't believe belonged to her," Arnold said, voice low but hard. "That's what you saw. We had reason to verify you humiliated a teenager in front of strangers, rifled through her belongings, let her memories hit the floor like trash." Charles opened his mouth, but no words came. Arnold didn't need them. You let your staff touch what wasn't theirs, laugh at what they didn't understand, spill her life across a table and then call it procedure. Donahue's arms dropped to his sides. Marquez rubbed the back of his neck. No one moved. Phones were still up, though. You could feel the recordings happening, silently gathering evidence. Not for law, but for the court of everyone. Arnold turned his head slightly. She didn't pretend to be someone else. She didn't ask for special treatment. He pointed not at them, but at Ava. She walked in with her name, and that's all it took for you to treat her like a liar. Tina had reappeared, hovering by the check-in desk. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, but her posture had shifted, shoulders lower, jaw less sharp. Arnold noticed. His tone changed, not louder, colder. "You called security." She didn't answer. He took a step toward her. "You opened the bag." "Nothing," he asked, quieter still. "Who dropped the mug?" Marquez finally said something. It slipped. Arnold's eyes locked on him. "That mug," he said, "was the last thing her father gave her before he died in a fire. He was my son, not by blood, but by choice. Just like she is." The words landed, not like a speech, like a verdict. "You watched her pick up the pieces of that mug," he continued, "the same way she's picked up the pieces of everything else people like you break." Charles exhaled through his nose. Tried again. We'll issue a formal apology. Arnold didn't flinch. I'm not here for your statement. A pause. I'm here because you thought no one would come for her. He turned back to Ava. She didn't say a word, but something in her face had changed. Not defiance, not victory, just clarity. The room was holding its breath, waiting for what came next, and Arnold wasn't finished. Not yet. By now, no one was pretending not to look. Phones were angled without shame, some faces burned with discomfort, others with thrill. The scene was no longer just happening, it was being documented, spread, clipped for contextless virality. Ava felt it but didn't turn. She stayed where she was, near the edge of the frame, neither hidden nor centered. Her hands rested in her lap. The dried blood on her sleeve had flaked, leaving faint rust-colored lines, a shadow of earlier humiliation. Arnold stayed where he stood. His back was to her, but he wasn't blocking her. He was anchoring her. Charles cleared his throat. Again. It didn't sound confident. We've reinstated her boarding, and we're happy to offer private lounge access. Priority services. Arnold didn't blink. She doesn't need your upgrade, he said. Charles tilted his head, confused. She earned her seat. She just wants it back. The line landed like a gavel. Quiet, exact. Nothing else needed. Behind the check-in desk, Tina had disappeared, gone without a sound. Donahue was no longer trying to justify anything. His eyes were locked somewhere middle distance, as if wondering how he'd ended up on the wrong side of someone's legacy. A young agent entered the scene, nervous, holding a tablet, glancing between Charles and Arnold like someone caught between tides. He muttered something to the manager, low and quick. Charles winced. Regional director's on his way down. He was briefed. Arnold didn't respond. He didn't have to. The air had already shifted. Where earlier it had buzzed with judgment and silent laughter. Now it held something quieter, heavier, guilt, or maybe recognition. A woman near the back lowered her phone, not because the moment had ended, but because something inside it had changed. Her kid, maybe 10, whispered, "That's her grandpa." The woman nodded, then added softly, "That's the real one." Arnold turned back to Ava. She hadn't moved, but her shoulders were different, less folded. Her chin lifted maybe an inch. Not defiance, just presence. "Ready to go?" he asked her gently. She nodded. It was a better nod this time. But they didn't move. Not yet. Because the story wasn't just hers anymore. The people in that terminal, the ones who laughed, recorded, whispered they were in it now too. No one asked if she was okay. No one stepped forward. But some, quietly, shifted their weight like they suddenly didn't love the spot they'd taken in the crowd. One girl, maybe college age, caught Ava's eye for a second. Just a glance. Then looked away fast. Embarrassed. It was small. But it stayed with her. For the first time that day, Ava wasn't trying to disappear. She just sat, visible, whole, even if she was still bleeding under the sleeve. The cabin hummed with the muted stillness of first class, polished wood panels, gentle overhead lights, citrus-infused air, seats that reclined with a whisper. Ava sat by the window. She hadn't spoken since they boarded. Not because there was nothing to say, just because some silences hold more weight than words could lift. The cloth-wrapped mug shards were in her lap again. Still tucked in the napkin she'd grabbed from baggage claim. Still holding together, somehow, even broken. Arnold sat beside her, adjusting his seat without ceremony. His movements weren't sharp, but deliberate. A man who understood weight, not just physical, but the kind people carry without knowing until they stop walking. He looked at her hands first, still bleeding. She shook her head. He didn't ask to see. He just reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a white handkerchief. Frayed at one corner, folded. Not new, not fancy, just clean. "Let me..." She hesitated, then slowly opened her palm. The cut was shallow but red, a little swollen around the edge. He dabbed gently, not like cleaning, more like remembering something. They didn't care, Ava said, voice quiet. They just threw everything. Arnold didn't answer right away. He folded the cloth again and wrapped it around her thumb with careful pressure. I know, I thought if I stayed calm, they'd listen. If I didn't fight back, maybe they'd believe me. He leaned back slightly, his hand resting on his knee. You shouldn't have to fight just to be seen. She blinked. Her eyes were glassy, but dry, still holding. They made me feel like I wasn't real. Arnold looked at her, not with pity, with clarity. You know who else used to say that? She shook her head. Your father. She froze. He hadn't brought him up in years. There was a fire downtown, Arnold said, voice softer now. Third-story apartment. Night shift hadn't arrived. People screaming from windows. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. He ran inside, pulled out two old men, a kid, a mother, smoke so thick you couldn't see your hands, roof groaning, a pause. He went back in for a fifth, longer pause. He didn't come out. Ava looked down, her hand pressed slightly tighter around the bundle in her lap. Arnold continued, his voice steady but lower. He didn't die because he was reckless. He died because he couldn't stand the idea of someone being invisible. The plane shifted slightly as it taxied, a distant rumble beneath their feet, the kind you don't really notice unless you're already holding your breath. She nodded slowly. I didn't know that, she whispered. You didn't need to, Arnold said. You lived it anyway. She leaned her shoulder against his, lightly. No words. And this time, when he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. The plane began to climb. Outside Ava's window, the lights of the airport stretched like blurred constellations, lines of gold and white, melting into cloud-dark sky. She didn't look away, not at first. There was something calming about the distance, how the world got quieter the farther you rose from it. Beside her, Arnold settled into the seat like he'd done it 1,000 times. No ceremony, just presence. Her fingers were still curled around the cloth in her lap. The napkin had loosened slightly, and a small shard of ceramic peeked through a curved edge. Ink still visible. My fighter. She didn't hide it. Arnold glanced at it once, then at her. You gonna hold on to that the whole flight, he asked. She nodded. I think so. He didn't press. Instead, he reached beneath the seat, pulled out a bottle of water from his jacket pocket, and placed it on her tray table. Hydrate. She almost smiled. Almost. It tugged at the edge of her mouth, just enough to break the weight. A moment passed, then her voice, low. I thought if I didn't say anything, if I just cooperated, they'd let me be. Arnold's answer came like stone softened by years. You don't have to be loud to be right. She looked down at the broken mug in her lap. They took everything. My voice, my name, even the mug. No, he said gently. They tried to take it. You carried it through. Silence again, but not empty. Just full. Then she said something she hadn't planned to. A truth that had sat in her throat for years. I know I'm not really... Dad was adopted. I'm not your blood. He didn't flinch. Don't finish that sentence. Her mouth froze. He continued, his voice even but final. You're mine, not because of blood, because I chose you, because I saw him in you. And now, I see you. A tear slid down her cheek. Just one. She didn't wipe it. He didn't mention it. He looked out the window. People like us, we don't get to blend in. Doesn't matter what seat we book. There'll always be someone who needs us to prove we belong. She nodded. That's why I run. He turned back. Why? Because they're broken, she said, glancing at the mug. But they still mean something. He sat back, satisfied. The plane steadied. The hum softened into something more bearable. And Ava reached over, without hesitation this time, and took his hand. Outside the window, the night held. But inside that cabin, something settled, not fixed, not forgiven, but seen. She didn't need the crowd to understand, didn't need an apology to feel whole again. She had the pieces, and for the first time all day, she wasn't trying to put them back together. She was just holding them, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.